They had been told horror stories about America. For years, Nazi propaganda whispered the same message into every German soldier's ear. If the enemy captures you, your life is over. They said Americans tortured prisoners, starved them, forced them into mines, and made them live like animals. To surrender, they believed, was to walk willingly into hell. So when thousands of German soldiers finally laid down their weapons in North Africa, France and Italy, they did so with trembling hands and silent dread. The war had stripped them of everything: pride, power, and purpose. Now, lined up under a foreign sun, disarmed and surrounded by men in strange uniforms, they waited for the punishment they believed was coming. But the first surprise came almost immediately. The Americans weren't shouting. There were no rifle butts slamming into ribs, no screaming guards or blows to the head. Instead, the captured Germans saw something they had never expected on a battlefield: calmness. The guards spoke in short commands, yes, but without hatred. They handed out water. A few even offered cigarettes. One soldier later wrote, "It confused us. We thought they were pretending." As the trucks began to move, the prisoners braced for cruelty. They had heard stories of men crammed into cattle cars, left for days without food or air. But as they climbed aboard, another shock awaited: clean transport vehicles, real seats, open air, and rations. White bread, meat, and coffee. Real coffee, not the bitter imitation they drank in Germany. The first bites were hesitant. "Maybe it's poisoned," one man whispered. But hunger spoke louder than fear. Soon the sound of chewing replaced silence, and disbelief filled every face. What kind of enemy fed their captives like this? Days later, as the ships crossed the Atlantic, the men stared at the endless blue horizon, realizing they were leaving Europe and everything they knew behind. Some believed they were being taken to forced labor camps. Others feared secret experiments. None imagined that beyond that ocean lay one of the strangest chapters of their lives, a chapter of confusion, kindness, and quiet transformation. When the ships finally neared the American coastline, the prisoners crowded on deck, and what they saw stunned them. Skyscrapers piercing the clouds, harbors filled with cranes and ships as far as the eye could see, smoke rising from massive factories that seemed to never sleep. America wasn't just big, it was unimaginably big. One officer murmured, "Now I understand why we lost." The buses took them inland, past endless roads, glowing neon signs, children waving, farmers and tractors, women carrying groceries in baskets. Everything looked peaceful, untouched by war. There were no bombed buildings, no ruins, no fear in the air. To men who had lived through air raids and rubble, the sight of normal life was almost unbearable. When the convoy finally stopped, barbed wire came into view. The camps. But even that didn't look as expected. There were clean barracks, medical tents, and organized rows of buildings. Guards stood watchful, but not cruel. The air smelled of cooked meals, not decay. Each man was registered, searched, and assigned a bunk. The process was efficient, but not humiliating. And when the first meal bell rang, disbelief deepened again. On their trays lay meatloaf, potatoes, vegetables, and milk. Actual milk. Some men refused to eat at first, convinced it was a trick. But one by one, hunger broke their pride. Soon the mess hall was filled with the quiet clatter of spoons and forks. "Are we really prisoners?" a young soldier whispered. "Or is this some kind of test?" The older men shook their heads. No one had an answer. The next days blurred into routine. Morning roll calls, work assignments, and meals. All managed with discipline but without cruelty. The guards carried rifles but often talked casually, even smiling at times. The camp wasn't a paradise, but it wasn't a nightmare either. Soap and shaving kits were handed out. There were showers, barber stations, and laundry rooms. Some barracks even had stoves for warmth. The prisoners began to realize something extraordinary. Their captors seemed more interested in keeping them comfortable than in breaking them. Letters from home arrived through the Red Cross, and the men were allowed to write back. They could hardly describe their reality without sounding insane. "We are well fed," one letter read, "and the guards are polite." Most censored those lines themselves, afraid their families would think they'd lost their minds. Outside the fences, America continued to live, and sometimes the prisoners were sent to join it. Under watchful eyes, groups of German POWs were transported to nearby farms to help harvest crops or fix fences. The locals stared at first, but quickly grew used to them. Farmers nodded in greeting, children waved, and some women even offered pies or lemonade to the guards. It was absurd. Men who had marched under Hitler's banners were now picking apples for American civilians. And instead of hatred, they found indifference, or worse, friendliness. At night, the barracks hummed with whispers. "They treat us like humans," one said softly. Why? No one knew. The food, the comfort, the strange freedom to write letters, it all felt unreal. Some insisted it was a trap, a trick to weaken their loyalty. Others began to doubt everything they had been told. "If they are monsters," one man murmured, "they hide it well." But the most surprising part of their captivity hadn't even begun. Weeks passed, and the rhythm of camp life became familiar. Work during the day, meals in the mess hall, card games, chess, or quiet reading in the evenings. The Red Cross delivered small packages, soap, cigarettes, sometimes even books. And then one evening, something changed. A guard entered the barracks and announced, "Tonight, entertainment. You're invited to the assembly hall." The men exchanged puzzled glances. Entertainment for prisoners. They followed the guards through the camp, their boots crunching on the gravel as they stepped toward a hall glowing with light and mystery, unaware that what awaited inside would change how they saw the entire world. They walked silently through the night, their boots crunching on the gravel as guards led them to a large wooden hall. A faint glow spilled out from its windows, and a low hum of machinery buzzed within. None of the prisoners knew what to expect. Entertainment. That word felt alien in a prison camp. Most assumed it would be propaganda, perhaps a lecture or a film mocking Germany's defeat. Inside, benches were neatly arranged, and a large white sheet hung against the far wall. A projector rattled softly behind them. The men sat down, restless and suspicious. The lights dimmed, the hum grew louder, and suddenly, the screen came alive. It wasn't propaganda. It was a Hollywood movie. Laughter echoed through the hall as a black and white comedy played before their eyes. The prisoners stared in disbelief. They had been told that Americans were heartless, arrogant, violent. But here, on the screen, were Americans joking, laughing, falling in love, helping each other. The men didn't understand every word, but they could read the faces, the warmth, the human emotion. For the first time, they saw America not as an enemy, but as a civilization filled with life. One man whispered, "They're like us." Another nodded, eyes fixed on the glowing screen. For an hour and a half, they forgot the barbed wire, forgot their uniforms, forgot the war. They simply sat, men who had fought and killed, now watching a movie together in silence. When the lights came back on, no one spoke. Something unexplainable had shifted inside them. They walked back to their barracks that night, quiet, thoughtful. The world outside their walls suddenly felt bigger, softer, and more complicated than the one Hitler had painted for them. Over the next weeks, movie nights became a tradition. American guards would set up the projector, sometimes even popping corn, and the prisoners would gather eagerly. They watched everything: cowboy adventures, comedies, musicals, and war dramas. Each film was like a window into another world. One movie showed a poor man rising to success through hard work. Another told the story of a soldier returning home to his family. There was laughter, tears, and hope, emotions the war had nearly erased from their souls. Many of the prisoners began to question what they had been told for years. If these were the people they had fought, how could they be the monsters they were taught to hate? One soldier later wrote in his journal, "Hollywood films did what no propaganda could. They broke through our armor." Soon, English classes were offered in the camp. Some volunteered eagerly, others out of curiosity. But as they learned new words, they also learned new ideas: freedom, equality, opportunity. Simple words that carried heavy meaning. Guards noticed the change too. Conversations replaced silence. Laughter replaced fear. Prisoners began to help willingly with camp chores, even decorating their barracks for Christmas using scraps of paper and cardboard. The Americans allowed it. They even joined in, bringing a small tree from a nearby town. On Christmas Eve, something happened that no one could have imagined a year earlier. Inside a POW camp, surrounded by fences and armed guards, German prisoners and American soldiers sang together. The song was Silent Night, 2 languages, 1 melody. Some cried quietly. Others smiled faintly through the tears. It was a moment that erased, if only for a few minutes, the line between enemy and human. But not everyone accepted this peace so easily. Among the prisoners were die-hard Nazis, men still loyal to Hitler, men who saw kindness as weakness. They hissed insults at those who laughed with guards or watched American films. They called them traitors of the Reich. Some fights broke out in secret, especially when men dared to question the old beliefs. Yet something powerful was happening, a quiet rebellion against hate. The American camp commanders understood this psychology better than the Germans realized. They weren't just feeding or housing these men. They were reprogramming their minds. They wanted to show them a world without dictatorship, without fear, a world where power came not from obedience but from freedom. And it worked. Slowly the fear faded. Many prisoners started drawing, writing, even performing plays. Some formed small orchestras using handmade instruments. The camps became strange little islands of reflection, places where once fanatical soldiers rediscovered what it meant to be human. Outside the fences, America was changing too. Newspapers reported that German POWs were helping rebuild bridges, farms, and factories. Some Americans protested, saying the enemy didn't deserve comfort. But others argued that kindness was the most powerful weapon of all. As spring arrived, the camps became more alive. Flowers grew near the fences, gardens were planted, and laughter returned. The men began to look less like prisoners and more like people waiting to start over. One afternoon, an officer named Wilhelm sat under a tree sketching. A young American guard approached him. "You draw well," he said, handing Wilhelm a pencil sharper than his own. Wilhelm nodded, surprised. "Thank you," he replied in broken English. "In Germany, I was an artist. Before the war." The guard smiled. "Then maybe one day you'll paint again, in peace." That night, Wilhelm wrote a letter home. "They show us films here," he wrote, "stories about love, hope, and laughter. The people we were told to hate. They are not as we imagined. I don't know what to believe anymore." By mid-1944, over 400,000 German prisoners were held in camps across America. From Texas to Wisconsin, from Georgia to California, each camp told the same quiet story. Enemies being treated like guests, men who arrived full of hate, leaving full of doubt. And while most never saw a battlefield again, the war continued far across the ocean. Hitler still raged in his bunkers, cities still burned, millions still died, but inside those camps, something else was being rebuilt: minds, consciences, souls. For many, this strange kindness was unbearable. How could the enemy be so human? How could a country untouched by war still show compassion to those who tried to destroy it? These questions haunted them. And when the time came to go home, many would carry those questions across the ocean, questions that would quietly begin to change Germany itself. But before they left, one final lesson awaited them, a moment that would prove that the most powerful weapon America ever used wasn't a bomb, or a bullet, or even a movie. It was something far greater. Months passed, and the once defiant German soldiers had changed. The sharpness in their eyes had softened. The arrogance they carried into battle had faded into quiet reflection. Inside those American camps, something invisible had been happening, a transformation no weapon could ever achieve. The war in Europe was nearing its end. Word of Hitler's defeat spread like a storm through the camps. Some refused to believe it. Others broke down, silently crying in disbelief. The empire they were taught to die for had collapsed, and now there was nothing left but the question, what comes next? When the official announcement came, "Germany has surrendered," the prisoners stood in stunned silence. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, one by one, some men removed their caps and bowed their heads. The war that had consumed their youth, their families, and their souls was finally over. In the following weeks, American guards noticed something strange. The prisoners seemed restless, not from anger, but from uncertainty. The war had ended, but their journey hadn't. Where would they go now? What would they return to? Their homes were gone, their cities burned, their nation in ruins. For many, there was no home left to return to. The Americans, however, didn't rush them out. They continued to treat them with dignity. Food was served on time, medical care continued, and the guards, who once stood distant, now spoke freely with them. Some even shared their own war stories, their losses, their fears. It was during these final months that the greatest lessons took root. In those fenced worlds, thousands of German soldiers learned more about democracy, freedom, and humanity than they ever had under the shadow of the swastika. They saw that kindness could exist without weakness, that strength didn't require cruelty, and that respect could cross even the deepest divides. There were classes now: history, philosophy, even lessons on how democratic governments worked. The Americans weren't trying to humiliate them. They were preparing them, planting the seeds of a new Germany long before the war even ended. One prisoner, a school teacher before the war, was given permission to start teaching basic English to others. He began every class with a single phrase: "Freedom begins with understanding." That sentence spread like wildfire. Even men who had once shouted Nazi slogans began repeating those words in quiet corners of the barracks. By the end of 1945, the U.S. began arranging the return of prisoners. Each camp received its orders, and the men lined up once more, not as enemies, but as changed souls. The guards shook their hands. Some hugged, a few even cried. There were no cheers, no celebrations, just silence and the unspoken truth that something extraordinary had happened between two enemies who were never supposed to understand each other. When the ships left the American coast, many of the men stood on deck, watching the skyline fade into mist. The skyscrapers of New York, the bridges, the endless light, all slowly disappeared into the horizon. "It feels like leaving behind a dream," one man whispered. Another replied, "No, it feels like waking up from one." When they reached Europe, reality hit hard. Their homeland was a graveyard of broken buildings and broken hearts. Streets they once marched through were now rubble. Children begged for food. Women wandered like ghosts through the ruins. And yet, amid the destruction, these returning men carried something rare: hope. They spoke of America like a myth, a land where even prisoners had been treated as humans. They told stories of clean camps, of guards who shared cigarettes, of movies and laughter and kindness. Most Germans didn't believe them at first. It sounded impossible after years of pain. But as more and more POWs returned with the same tales, the truth became undeniable. Soon, American ideals began to echo across the ruins of Germany: democracy, freedom, fairness. They were no longer foreign words. They were goals. Those who had lived inside the camps became teachers, writers, and builders of the new Germany. Many of them openly admitted that their transformation began the day they realized the enemy wasn't what they had been told. Historians would later call it re-education through humanity. No forced indoctrination, no propaganda, just decency powerful enough to rebuild minds. Years later, some of those former prisoners returned to America, not as captives, but as visitors. They stood on the same soil where they had once been imprisoned and thanked the very people who had guarded them. One of them said during a speech, "In those camps, we discovered something we never knew existed. A nation that defeated us with compassion." It's hard to imagine, but it's true. The German POW camps in America became silent classrooms of morality. While bombs destroyed Europe, these camps rebuilt something deeper: conscience. Not everyone changed, of course. Some carried their hatred till the end. But for many, the war ended not when they were captured, but when they were shown mercy. One former prisoner wrote in his diary years later, "I learned that the strongest country is not the one that conquers others. It's the one that refuses to lose its humanity, even in victory." And perhaps that was the real victory America achieved in World War II, not just the fall of Hitler's empire, but the rebirth of thousands of men who went home carrying an idea stronger than any army: that kindness can outlive hate. For decades, historians focused on the battles, the guns, the tanks, the victories. But behind those battles was a quieter story, the story of men who entered America as enemies and left as witnesses of its soul. And somewhere in an old German village, when an old man told his grandchildren about the war, he didn't speak of blood or glory. He spoke of a night when, as a prisoner, he sat in a wooden hall watching a movie and realized something profound: that the people he had been taught to hate were capable of compassion greater than any weapon. That night, for him, the war ended. And for humanity, it was a reminder that even in our darkest moments, mercy can change the world.